Trump has started this tariff war, and it's had an effect on the Chinese economy, although the statistics seem to show that China's foreign trade has not suffered. And the slowdown in the economy has got something to do with the transition of the economy from export to domestic demand. For a country that has spent all these years putting its money in its pocket or in the bank, to get them to take the money out of the bank and out of their pocket and spend it is a 20 to 30 year process. It doesn't happen quickly. And whilst the policymakers are surrounded by people from all over the world, and even within China, who've got good ideas about what they should do, only they know what is concretely happening. And it is not surprising that with the tariff wars and with the transition, that there is some slowdown in the Chinese economy. But if you look at the tariff war, firstly, if there will be an economic consequence from it, China's got far smaller distance to fall than America. America is a much higher per capita economy than the Chinese one, and if the American one starts to fall, at what point will it start to hurt and shout back at Trump, stop this? Because the people in America don't care about China. They care about their income and what it can buy. The people in China care about their income and what it can buy, but they're also not going to be bullied by foreigners. They have a long history with Europeans, with the Japanese. They're not going to allow themselves. They've been through 2 wars in Korea and Vietnam, and if they get threatened, the Chinese people don't want it, but they will take and accept a lower standard of living in order to maintain independence and their own direction. So yes, there is some slowdown. One hopes that because the Europeans, the Japanese, the Indians, all these countries, they all want a return to growth, and we may see a recession before we see a return to growth, and that may do some damage in China. If you ask me which economy is better placed to deal with a global recession, it's China, because China is building its domestic market, whereas other countries continue to be over-dependent on export markets. So China's taken the right long-term decision, and I think that's why the pressure is on President Trump about this tariff war.
Talking about the China-US trade war,
Yeah.
I think it is initiated by the US government.
Yeah.
And China always insists on this, the war is a lose-lose situation for both China and the US.
Yeah.
It seems that the Trump still insists on to carry on this war to let China surrender. How do you see the ongoing process of trade war?
Well, this is the 4th different way America has tried to manage China. The most recent previous one was tilt to Asia with TPP and TTIP. And before that, you might think that the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were about creating bases around China. Some people thought that was why the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was formed, to block American moves into Asia in a military way. So we've seen different ways in which America has tried to manage. It's tended to focus more in recent times on what was the axis of evil. It was Iraq, North Korea and Iran, wasn't it? So we've seen America constantly diverted by the Middle East away from focusing on China. Now we have a situation where TPP and TTIP failed. They failed because it's much too complex. China did foreign trade FTAs with certain areas of the world which were well researched and which were clearly in both parties' interests. But you know that the failure of the Doha round in 2002 in Hong Kong, the Japanese rice and other beef and other people, Thailand and so on, is because the Doha round couldn't deal with the local resistance of the Chinese, of the peoples, particularly of Asia. So TPP and TTIP didn't work. Now America is moving to try and deal with the rise of China through a tariff war. When it happened, I said, this is not difficult for China. China has reduced dependency on America and Europe from 70% of its foreign trade to just over 30% in about 10 to 12 years. So to reduce it more is clearly within China's capacity. But more significant than that, the trade deficit that President Trump talked about can be removed over 3 years. It's not a difficulty. But then it became clear with subsidies, technology transfer, innovation by 2025. The Americans started adding more things. Why? Because China showed an ability to solve the problems that the Americans were throwing. So the Americans began to add more of their basic concerns. And at this point, China said, hold on a second, this is a moving feast. And secondly, the Democrats moved to support President Trump. At that point, China must have realized that any deal they did this year could be changed after the election in the United States. So whilst President Trump wants to do a deal and get this finished and done with, China is going to be very careful about doing a deal that could be undone in 2 years' time by a new Democratic president or by a President Trump who wants to come back and try again. So China is sitting watching this very carefully. I think, I said to my friends in America, I wouldn't have started this way. They need to read Chairman Mao on contradiction, because it gives an example of how China will approach something like this. This is a major contradiction for China, and it will deal with it philosophically as well as economically and practically. I think America has left it 15 years too late to try and manage. I don't think America could ever stop the rise of China, because the Chinese people are so determined to have a standard of living and a way of life that is of their own making and is reasonable. And even if it was stopped for 10 or 15 years, or even 20 or 25 years, eventually it would happen again. China would rise again. There's no doubt about that. What America might have done and still could do is be far more imaginative. And let me take a second of your time to give you an example. America is very concerned about Huawei. Its concern about Huawei is, there is all the stuff about spying, but spying in telecom companies is part of the world. Their real concern is Huawei is way advanced on its competitors. And what America is concerned about is that AI and big data will be controlled by 5G under Huawei's control. So it's trying to make life difficult for Huawei and create a situation where American and European competitors can catch up with Huawei and pass them by. But China knows that and will deal with that. It's not unreasonable for America to say to China, we would like you to consider an IPO of Huawei. We would like to have foreign ownership of Huawei. We have foreign ownership of the Western companies that are in telecoms. Why can't we have foreign ownership of Chinese companies? Maybe China wouldn't have liked that, because it likes the way things are. It's done very well for China. But China would have had to stop and think. It wants to be in the world, and the world is asking it to do something differently. And China would have thought about it, and I think probably in the end would have compromised. And Huawei would still be a Chinese company, but it would have significant foreign ownership, and it would have more access to world markets. So the American style, I spent most of my life working between Americans and Chinese. American style is to do great research, and then they tend to make an emotional decision, and then they tend to try and force issues. It's the American way. It's how the United States was created. It's a country of refugees. It's a country of missionaries. It's nobody in America comes from America. They all came from somewhere else, except a small number of Indians. So it's a very complex country with a lot of very different ways and characteristics. But it has built one of the world's great economies through a series of actions by individuals building businesses in a very capricious and a very personal way. And that is the way they run their government as well. And China has to say, well, this is not the way we would do it, but has to try and help America to understand better that China is not a threat. And I'm sure China is saying things to America that America can't hear, because it wants a win, it wants a victory. But in time, I think America will want an outcome, will get fed up with this instability in their stock markets, instability in financial markets, instability in export markets, instability in investment,